How's it going, everyone? Welcome. Euler here. So I just want to dive deep into React as a way to finally wrap this model as soon as possible. And by reading and understanding and capture the idea and the truth of this, and then write down on my own personal notes. Let's get into this, right? So again, just to make a quick recap of how do I get here. So on the first model, or on the model 0, we look at more topics relevant to suggestions about how you can learn, right? Whether it is by using the blogging and interleaving, all right? So you, for example, you read this content, you read this particular model of CSS, and then you read some other content that has some relationship with this, and that's what you're doing, right? Interleaving versus blocking, which is, hey, focus exclusively to this until you uh, get it. So in the model 1 is, well, a little history of how do we get here, especially as an industry, where these things come up, who develops now, right? React, what are the problems that Facebook has back then when it comes to show a user interface to the user, so they can now is receive notifications, create their account, of course, uh, look at their family, friends, and add some friends, and started to create their own circle where they can post updates to that, and so on and so forth. So in the meantime, they have now this particular problem where different pieces of UI needs to update. So because in that particular case, this was the notification, okay? Uh, the user see a new notifications, and when they click on a the chat app show off. There's nothing new there. So they have now this particular issue of how they can synchronize a particular state that is common across different UI. And this is now what powers is this whole idea, right? When you now have is one piece of data that you want to share across different user elements and keep it synced with them. So the R&D at Facebook developed this tool, so now we can use that on the web and also in other platforms like the mobile with React Native or the WebLG, right? Each one of them now, what they do is to provide certain user interface, common user interface, or wrap some of this common user interface into this nice little piece of information that React keep track of that in this nice UI information state where React, whether it is on the web or on the mobile or even on the WebLG, React can keep track of. And I do think that's quite mind-bending, powerful, the whole idea. And to truly understand that, we look at how can we create our own React, right? Which is a simple JavaScript functions that you're going to pass is some of the attributes that you want to attach to this particular HTML DOM, and modify that. So you're going to return now is the elements, the new elements here that describe is the current state of your applications. So that's great because as I explore that with just plain functions, JavaScript functions, documents from the document models, right? Which just you create a new element and then you return the new state of that element. as a JSON-like objects. So then we're starting to see how tedious and verbose it is to create all of this kind of user interface, and start to go with this language or markdown known as JSX, right? Which at the end of the day, we are writing is JavaScript in markdowns, and also attached is the CSS. So because this is the idea, so now we are writing our applications in JSX. Most of us are common with. I am common with that. I wasn't. Definitely not a year ago. Not at all. And now, the thing here is the way of how we are going to organize our code now are completely different of the traditional web development, right? When you have the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. However, that doesn't mean that at the current state of 2025, using plain old JavaScript, CSS, and HTML is something that you shouldn't do that. The web has evolved vastly, and I love it. And so the React community as well. So, but in any case, this way of organizing your applications in this new web development, quote, is that all of your information will now live in one single file, right? So this JSX what allows us to now have a markdown where we can reuse a lot of the logic in our UI instead of having, for example, a specific language like other templated language engines out there has, whether it is Laravel with Blade, or in Shopify they're using well, I don't recall right now, but it doesn't matter. But all of these template engines, they have to create their own mini languages to handle logic, aka how I'm going to now render is collections of values or conditions markdown, conditional markdown. Now, as I explore this and see the difference between JSX and HTML, and JSX and these template engines, right? And how you can create your components, this way of creating user interface that is heavily influenced by this, of course, by Facebook, formerly Facebook, now Meta, is, well, so what is now the anatomy of these components, right? So this component is now a function where you have is the logic, and then you're gonna return now is the markdown, and also define is your style in there. So I also look at how you can create is your components. What is the architecture or the project-based structure? The project structure of this, the folder structure of this new web development. When you have your entry points that you're going to attach to the DOM, the document, and that is what you define is the CSS, for example, some configurations, and then you have now files that are relevant to React, right? So the first one is files that are relevant to the basic or the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, all right? And now the app.js is are files that are relevant to, sorry, a mosquito, go in peace. Files that are relevant to the React, right? So whether it's context or any piece of information that React needs to be aware of and share across all of these different components. So okay, and as I went through and explain and understand how you can create your components, the anatomy of your components, and the anatomy of the web development, the basic folder structures, well, then how you can now is, or what are the properties or the common components that React offers, right? So for example, fragment is one of them to avoid you polluting the DOM, okay? Based on the way of how you need to return, or when similar when you define is now HTML content, right? They need a pattern that contains several of its children elements. And well, how you can render a list of elements, right? Using now the JavaScript array built-in operations. And also is how you can now is render conditional a markdown, whether it is using the if statement or the expressions, whether it is and or ternary operators, right? And now how you can attach CSS here. So with that, okay, we're using is the CSS to do so. And what art is doing behind the scenes. So with that, right, then now I'd look at the way of how you can now enable interactivity or working with states, right? So traditionally, the way how you do that in HTML and CSS with JavaScript is two ways. Or you now attach a function to an event listener, which is referencing an element, HTML element, or in that particular element, you now is call your functions in that event handler at the attribute, at the tag, right? But in this case, now JavaScript or React is now handle that for you, which is something interesting that Martin Fowler, one of the founders, you might say, of the Agile Manifesto, describe, which is, hey, anytime that your functions are being called for you, this is what a framework does. But when you call your function directly, this is what a library does. So here React now sits in a framework because you have now this inversion of control. So you are passing now control to this box, the framework React, to do whatever stuff that needs to be done. And you just only care about is the output, right? So this is what happens here when you want to handle events, all right? So you're passing now a functions reference to that event listener, and those events now follows a specific camel case structure, okay, to avoid any collisions. And is when the user not trigger that event, React is going to handle that for you, all right? So when that happens, if you want to provide interactivity, we need to somehow is to keep track of some piece of information over time. The way React does this is by exposing that a built-in features known as hook. They use a state, right? So in JavaScript, if you want to hold a piece of information over time, you rely on a closure. This goes beyond the scope of today's video, but I do think that's quite interesting. But in the case of React, which is built on top of JavaScript, is providing you this, let's say, closures that are holding that piece of information across your application. And when you're creating, for example, is a counter, a classic example one, right? You now hold that piece of information that, hey, when the user now triggers some events, and then you, inside of that event handler, you want to update your state. So React is going to now pass to some internals, so known as the core React loop, which is the user state. And this is, well, that React is going to detect when the component trigger or which component trigger that state update, and if that component is like a function that is made of that return is a markdown, and if in that Markdown has more React components, it will continuously call that until there is no more. Effectively, on each one of those calls, creating now is a JSON, aka this structure that represent now the new state of the application. This is mind bending and revealing to me right now, because when you starting with React and all of this kind of stuff, because there is a lot of magic things that happen. The thing here is that it is a sequence of stuff that happen, and they have this narrative, and if you're able to describe that, that'll be much more power to you first. And second, you don't have to you worry about having better problems, well, right? I don't know, you are now in Italy, or you are now in Thai, Bali, so on and so forth, right? To how do you call it? I don't know. You wanna go and uh, invest in those places, or go and travel, and whatever thing you want to do. So this is part of the having better products. You're starting a company that now Drive is. So you create a company. I know I'm stumbling myself upon here a little bit. I'm chunky here of what I'm saying. But the thing here is that now you understand this, you're starting to have better problems. That's the whole point. That's the whole idea. So with that, right now, after I went through these specific stuff that I need that the to describe is the core React loop, right? So it's the trigger, and then once React detect that, is going to create now is this new state of the UI, this information, right? As the render phase, unlike, for example, in computer graphics, this is a word reserved for taking our raw inputs, right? Let's say you have now in computer applications like Blender, you have now this model. Let's say you want to create is a Link, or Ganondorf, or a Mario, or Luigi, right? And Browser and Peach, right? So you have all of these 3D models, right? And then you want to create now an image for that. Right? So the rendering process is to take now this unprocessed raw data and create an output out of this. And this output is this image, this two-dimensional image, or perhaps a video as well. But in any case, in the case of React, it's different. It's the process of spotting the difference between two snapshots, spotting the difference between two pieces of information that describe is the UI state as a JSON, and then now apply only the bare minimum necessary DOM updates, which is known as the commit phase, that when the browser detects those changes, it's going to repaint that, right? So this is the core loop here. And anytime that you want to update your state, this is asynchronous. This will happen is on the next render, right? And luckily for us, now we can actually batch multiple state updates in one single handler. And now React is going to handle that for you. So if you imagine that you now need to update your state, needs to update several of those states in a handler, right? It makes much more sense to bundle up into one single core loop, rather than do that individually, right? So all of this coordinations that happens in the language, or that happen in the framework, is now taken care of for you. So you don't have to deal with that, or you might think you don't have to deal with that. So But in any case, so after we look and understand now what React is and so on and so forth, at least the core loop, I also look at, well, now how you can actually is do something that is fairly common in React. In web development is not only render a list of elements, but also is collecting data from a form. And this is now whether it's you don't use React, known as uncontrolled inputs, or you collect that data using React, right? Known as a control input. So here you're going to attach is the value and the handlers to the value and the event listener in that HTML tag or that input tag. So because these inputs have different ways to handle that. So for example, input tail type, password, all of them has similarities, but select and text area and radio buttons and checkboxes are not. So React say, hey, let's go to now wrap these particular elements to have a common interface where we can now is detect those changes. All right. So in the case of the select, we're gonna detect on change and attach the value here. In the case of the checkboxes, we're going to define is the value and true or false, right? And detect those change on the on change. All right. So this is also what I look. We actually create an example for that. So that makes a lot of sense, a ton of sense. And so after that, right, I went to describe is how you can work with complex data, especially when you define your state. So the TLDR is that let's going to do this using an object or an array. But if you need, for example, passive functions to initialize these components once and no more, right? But in the case of the objects, it is useful for us to also follow some certain rules. So define that as one single element. I'll be right back. So define those objects that are one single layer, and exactly. So define those objects. Exactly. So define those objects at a single layer, right? With one deep level, and don't and avoid nested objects because it will be very hard to actually update each one of them. And the other is to always return is a new state anytime you want to update your state, right? So why is that? It go beyond. This is a rabbit hole that you would like to go, and just describe from a high level is React is doing everything that it can to make things fast enough. So if you want to know, ask yourself, so how do you know that two objects has now a different content? So because when you compare two objects in JavaScript, it is based on its reference, not what it is content. And there are several techniques of how you can do that, right? So whether you go and compare each one of those key value per object, so you iterate each one of them, all right? If they have the same length, that'll be great. If they have different property length, it'll be quite challenging, right? So you started to see that this is the kind of problem that you need to deal with or to solve it. And well, it turns out that for this case, it is better for the overall web development and even for yourself to return always a new state, right? So after that, I look at how you can now is working with states, especially by lifting up the states as a way to now define if your components in a way that uh, yeah, now you can define your components in a way that the React weight works, all right? By passing down is the states and the handlers, and that at that level is detect those changes and then now trigger the state update, all right? So for example, with search bar, and also I look another state management that you can use, for example, Redux. They also have substance and so on and so forth. But the TLDR is that those have a specific use cases. So, for example, if you have now a back office, uh, you might not rely on React or Redux or this state management. You can go along with just context. Okay, but if you have now bigger or if the state if your applications now serve, so if your applications uh, if CEO for your application is important, it means that you're going to host that in a server and need to be ranked by search engine. Well, now defining an state and the server on the client using now Next might be convenient to go with. Or if you are defining is a or building a game, so now uh, you have a lot in there. you know, uh, yeah, that's a lot. Exactly, exactly. So alright, so yeah, so yeah. Now, uh, so here in this model is to also is look at what are the alternative that we have in the language, my bad, in the framework uh, as part of the toolbox. So why is this? Well, first because we need to understand, of course, React, and what are the additional tools in our toolbox that Facebook, formerly Facebook now Meta, they say, hey, it is important for us when you're developing web apps using the framework to have this, right? It is useful for us. Again, they have now bigger problems. Your Facebook, they have bigger scalable problems, scalability, and this is also something that I would like to go, especially with the company that I'm currently working on, is to understand truly those challenges, right? Not for the ethereal, not for the intellectual words, right? Things that might sound good and love, but I don't know. It's for the truth. It's for the heart of this. So in any case, here we're looking at this additional tool that we have here in React, and that is because we have now components, all right, as a way to organize all of our web app, and because components are a very powerful pattern, so you might look before React 17, the way how they do that is by calling a function, right? And in this function, React.create class, it allows you to pass the state, the event handlers, and now the render functions. But as the years, well, let me actually, I just think it's here. Where it is. Yes. Exactly. This is the joy of React. That's right. Yeah. Here we are. Is this? So this is the old way of how you can do this. All right. Let me actually charge here. Holy hell. So yeah, I got this. Let me. What is it? Alright. Let me put it here. And here. Diggy. I haven't received any emails or so far. Alright. There you go. So this is the traditional way of, this is how we write these components before React or prior to React 17, right? And this actually makes sense of the anatomy of the component. But then now the React team say, hey, let's go to now leverage is the components in React, right? So that's what we can have, or here we're using now the class keyword here, which is something that was introduced in ES6. And as you can see, the community and the people involved in the industry that are at the top, they are now is defining, so they're setting up the roadmap of yeah. So now they're setting up the roadmap, okay? So now that they are setting up the roadmap, how do you put it? Yeah. So now they're setting up the roadmap. And I guess so now they're setting up the roadmap of what needs to be done, what that industry needs to do. So they need to include now class keywords and ES6 models, way to organize the code, and then so the React team, right, say, hey, because we are handling is now the logic, the markdown, and the style here. This is one good way to organize our code, because now we have now this UI component, let's say a button that you can carry over around your programs, and then you can reuse that, right? But sometimes you need to add some business logic to this. And the way to do that is by using now some particular patterns before that, which is, hey, let's go to now use now a wrapper component, a React component, that is going to act as a data pipeline, or that is going to treat this data for us, okay? And then render the components, the UI elements. So because of that, because we need to add some business logic to this user interface. So we have now is this huge nested component structure, where some of those components are now handling a specific business use case. So for example, router context, Apollo for handling network requests, something that I'm going to also look at this. Connect, which is passing data through the context. So connect is passing data through the context. And then you have now error policy and authentication. So all of this piece of informations, to do some data treatment, or do some sort of data manipulations to be used in the UI, right? So as you can see, this can grow a lot, and in this case that it's a little blurry. You can see, hey, we have the transition group here in the CSS transition that actually is handling is this transitions in the page. Also, you look at the connect to pull data, exactly, to pull the data, the tree, exactly, and also connect to pull data through the tree. Connect is to pull data, is to pull data through the tree. Then you have is the scroll to route, which is handling is specifically, exactly, is handling is this behavior that we want to add. Okay, so scroll to top, scroll to top route is now handling is this, when a navigation happen, we want to scroll to the top of the document, right? Similar with the loadable component, which is a component specifically to lazy loading some of this component and show something in the meantime. But as you can see, so because we have one only tool to create our applications, so we overuse it, right? It is like having a hammer in your house and then hammering in the screw instead of screwing with the screwdriver, because that's the tool that we have, right? So the React team comes with another tool called hooks. In the previous models, and I look up them, we're going to look at several of them for discrete uses. And any concern about using a piece of logic through our app in multiple places, hooks similarly like a component, when you define a button to be used here and there, now you can define an event listener to manage it in a specific way, to do some data requests in some specific way. So in other words, instead of using components to handle this data manipulation or business logics, now you have hooks that allow you to encapsulate that logic in that way. So without needing to add all of this different, that makes a lot of sense. Without having to add all of these different components, or polluting is the UI with all of these non-relative UI components. And one of them is the use ID hook. Okay, all right. So despite that in React everything is reusable, so the web community is against to this idea of making everything reusable, because they say some couple things needs to be global. You need an identifier. So if you want to match the user input in a form, you use now a for. So we can create now unique identifiers with the crypto.get random UUID, or using the mat.random, right? Exactly. Crypto.get random UUID or math.random, right? And if you want to create unique values, you can do that, right? But anytime that those values are computed at the component level, at the function level, they're going to be generating is new values. Here you can use now hooks, use a state to hold that specific value, all right? But because you need your identifiers be unique across your app, you can define is some sort of objects that actually store is this key value for you. So you have to manually in React keep track of those globally identifiers, so to avoid any collision, name collisions, for example. So here React, instead of you having to do that, so now they give you is a hook that is handling all of those, that is generating is unique identifiers across your UI. Using is the use ID. That makes a lot of sense. So now, for example, if you use ID for forms, okay, and then you want is to now bind that label to an input, so React is going to generate those unique identifiers as a simple object that you can use that across your UI, which are stable. Okay, makes a lot of sense. So for example, in this particular way here, right? So if you click here or if you click here, you have now several forms, right? Well, you just want is to, as a way to now promote user conversion and user retention, you have now that. Okay. And this is another exercise here, by the way. I don't think I take an image to that. I should be take an image to that. Which is this, right? And again, this is not to be used at production. This is not production code, right? So you guys this, right? Digging. Let me put it here. All right. Recent screenshot, Dicky, right? Good. Holy hell. And then I look at this rule of hooks. So when I use is React, when I use the ID, right? And then I try to exactly, because so we have talked that how hooks are special functions that allow to hook into React's internal. Makes sense. Okay. This makes a lot of fucking sense. Okay, so these hooks allow you to so there are special functions, they're normal functions, right? That allow you to hook into React. All right, so use state is one of them. Use ID is allow you to identify as unique identifiers on the component instance, right? But what happens if we try to at the component level, right? So use state allows to hook into a component's instance state. Use ID allows to create and store unique identifiers on the component instance. That's important here. Okay, so with use state, it allows you to hook into component states, okay, into components instance states, and the use ID allows you to create and store unique identifier on the component instance, right? So what happens if we try to call this function outside of the React context? So this is what's happening. You say, hey, it throw you an error. It say you might have a mismatched version of React and render, such as the React DOM. You might be breaking the rules of hooks, and you might have more than one copy in React in the same app. Invalid hook call for tips about how to debug in the fixed problem. So here, the first and the third are just rare edge cases. But as we read about this, you might be breaking the rules of hooks. What are the rules of hooks? Exactly, that's the question. So what are the rules of hooks, right? And it turns out that this React hooks, right, are now way of how you can use those React provide functions in a very specific way. And if you don't do that, so you're not going to benefit from, right? So bad things happen. And there are two rules of hooks that you should learn in order to make sure we always use hooks as React expect. First is hooks have to be called in the scope of React applications, okay? And we can call them outside of React component. That makes a lot of sense because at the end of the day, these hooks allow you to hook into the React internals, right? So now React expose some functionalities across components, instance, and your entire application. And the other is that hooks, we have to call our hooks at the top level of the component. This second rule is one of the is one that trip most people up. Why? Because why do we even need to define is hooks at the top of our component? If you take a look at this, hook react.def and learn, and especially on the reference, you got the hook. Remember information like user inputs, use the state, use reducer. Declare a state variable that you can update directly. Use built-in React hooks, state hooks, context hooks, ref hooks, effect hooks, and performance hooks. Oh my god. I'm nuts, bro. I'm nuts. I'm wild. I'm wild. Oh my god. Holy fuck. Oh, holy. I do think this is or your own hooks, right? Or your own hooks. Holy no. This is why. Oh my god. It all makes sense. It all makes sense. It all makes sense. All right. Jesus, fucking Christ. I'm laugh because now I can see is the skeleton. I can see the exo or the skeleton is the muscle skeleton tissue, something like that. Muscle skeletal, okay. Skeletal muscle. All right, and you may wonder what the French is a skeletal muscle. It's just a fancy terminal scientific term to describe. No, not skeletal. Oh, no, it's a skeletal. Tejido músculo esquelético. Exactly. Can you translate that into English? Please be my guess. Skeletal muscle. Oh, they call that? All right. Um, yeah, the skeletal muscle. Oh, okay. Mm-hmm. Holy hell. Um. So okay. That's interesting. Okay. So yeah, this is exactly what it is, man. I'm making this reference here because when I look at the anatomy of this, and I don't say anatomy like like a like a. I am not saying anatomy as to sound smart, right? To say something for for yeah. I am not saying is the anatomy like I am not saying anatomy. I am not saying the word anatomy. Okay. I am not saying the word anatomy like speech in cocktail party to sound smart, to appeal that. I'm saying that in the true sense of understanding when you look at the anatomy, the skeletal muscle, right, and you see now is you contemplate is how this bio machines works, biomechanical machines work, right? Um, and that's mind bending, bro. And that's pretty fucked up in mind bending. um, holy hell, holy moly, holy moly. Muscle skeleton, interesting. Skeletal muscle. So this is exactly what I'm looking here right now. This is exactly what I'm looking here. It's like, hey, React now provides this convenient hooks that you can hook into React because the developers uh, they see a recurring problem and come up with this solution. Hey, how can I remember a piece of information? State hook. Hey, how can I now is remember piece of information and pass down to distant components, right? How can I is hold some information that is not relevant for the rendering? How can I now is uh, connect these components to other systems, right? To external systems. How can I check the performance of these components, right? A common way to optimize re-rendering performance is to skip unnecessary work. For example, you can tell React to reuse a catch calculation or to skip a re-render if that data has not changed since the previous render. So this performance hook is to, hey, I don't want is to, oh, okay, I want is to avoid, I want to skip unnecessary work. I want to avoid re-renderings here, calling these functions. Hey, we have now the use memo and the use callback. To prioritize render, use one of these hooks, use transition and defer values. And then you have now other hooks that they find out valuable. These hooks are mostly useful to library authors and aren't commonly used in application code. Use debug value, use ID, and lets a component associate a unique ID with itself, typically used with accessibility APIs. And use sync external store lets a component subscribe to external store and use action state allow you to manage state of actions, right? So right now we look at the use ID or here all right, and this is interesting because I don't need to remember all of these different hooks. I just need to understand is what this hook is all about and what are the things that they allow us to, the use cases. Oh shit. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh my god. Oh my god. Okay. Hmm. Okay. Okay. So here is this, right? Now, rule of React, exactly, is that rule of hooks, right? So here, if you want to use these hooks, there's some rules that you must follow. Otherwise, something bad can happen, right? So first thing first is to only use hooks in React components, and the other is only call hooks at the top level, right? Despite that they don't mention that, why is this? All right. Um. mhm. Yeah, that's quite interesting. Uh. Mhm. Mhm. So if you look at this and say, hey, why we cannot use hooks in conditions or in return statement or inside of event handlers, because at the end of the day, well, they are just simple functions, right? So why we cannot use these simple functions uh, in those different places. A lot of people say, well, you know what? Yeah, I'm gonna follow the rules. I don't gonna ask. I don't wanna. I don't. I won't ask any questions and move on, right? But I do want to know is that why? Why is this the thing that it is? And it turns out is this, and it turns out that is this. So if you think of these hooks, right? And they say don't use with if statement, don't use with any looping syntax, don't use inside of event handlers. Um, uh, exactly. Don't use with any other hooks, right? So do not call hooks in class components. Do not call hooks inside of function passed to use memo, use reducer, or use effects. And do not call hooks inside try and catch finally block. If you break this rule, you might see these errors as it is. Um, and the question is that why? Right? So because one, if you think about it, all right, okay. If you think about it, that's actually that's it. Okay. Okay. All right, fellas. Take it, take it. Oh my God. Mm-hmm. Oh my God. Yeah, man. Oh, French toast. Mm-hmm. Okay. Um, hmm. So because if you think about this, right? Again, this is something that Josh Cormewa put in my mind, right? Uh, so how do you think that? So why will be a an explanation of not do of this, right? So the only explanation is, for example, if you use it in a condition, right? It means that if you have now sometimes that something happens and not, uh, and React doesn't allow you to do that, it's because it's keep tracking of this, or it's because you are in a unstable state. It means that sometimes you have this and sometimes you don't. So React, it looks like that it doesn't calculate it. It is hard for them to calculate that, right? That something is there and then not, and then sometimes there and then it's not, right? Uh, so it might look like that it have now a record, all right? But this record is, so this record must be stable, okay? AKA, or things are there or not. Right? So don't check me, don't move me the don't move me um, the goal, the goalkeeper. No, goalkeeper. No, is the goal. Holy hell, is him. Okay, the goal, the goal tending. I think it is tending. Oh no, but this is another one. The goal in soccer. The goal in soccer. Um, in English, it's like, what the fuck is this? Football goal. All right. Soccer goal. Football goal. Football net. Goal post. I do think is this. Okay, goal post. Oh yeah, exactly. So don't move me the goal post, right? Stay there. Stay there, bitch. Stay there. Okay. Okay. It makes a lot of sense. All right. So don't move me the goalpost, right? Don't move me the goalpost. Stay there. Stay there. So it turns out that um, as as React have this specific way to tell you, hey, our things are there or not. So this record, uh, React doesn't have any way right now to keep track of them, right? Keep track of them. So the order here matters. So the order here matters a lot. So this is why, for example, is when you put things here, okay, makes a lot of sense. Okay. So when you put things here, and if you change the order, so React doesn't have any way to keep track of the order of each of this state, right? Or each of these hooks. Um, right now, because I do think that it involved in a more coordination. So it will be a coordination problem here. If you put now hooks here and there and so on and so forth. Okay, or if you put now a hooks several times or not. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. When you don't have the ability to keep track of something, the order matters. Okay, so here starting to look at this algorithm of sorting and okay, of sorting and um, Jesus, sorting algorithms or Jesus, I don't even know how to do a binary search. If I dedicate time to this, I will. But right now, it doesn't come up with in my mind. So, but in any case, so yeah, mm, it makes a lot of sense. It makes a ton of sense. So when you don't have the ability to keep track, uh, you relies on the order, on how things are defined, how things come up with. But if you have now a coordination, you don't care about, or you have some logistic. You don't care about the order here. So the logistic, I will handle that for you. Mm. Hmm. Mm-hmm, 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 mm-hmm. Okay. Oh my God. All right. Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's think about it. Okay, let's think about it. If you, for some reason, um, have and have an estate, right? If you, for some reason, you have a um, exactly. If you, for some reason, okay, if you, for some reason, uh, so let's go out, right? Because all of these things are pretty basic stuff. Let's think about it. You want to organize a party, okay? And okay. Mm, okay. All right. You want to uh, okay. So let's say you want to hold several. You want to host several parties for your birth for yeah, let's say you want to host several parties for your birthday for your birthdays friends, okay? uh, so you have a list of binds you have a list, you have a grocery shop, okay? Okay, so you have a list of grocery. Okay, you have a groceries list, and grocery list in Spanish. In Spanish, okay. Uh, basic grocery list or common grocery store sections, so on and so forth, right? So let's say you want to host several parties for your birthday friends, right? So you have a grocery list uh, that uh, that is stable, right? So it won't change. It won't change. Um, it won't change. So make it it make it it make so it makes things easier It makes things easier, right? But if your it makes things easier if all of your friends have the same taste, and might be boring as well. You know, might be boring as well. So, but if your friends have a wild different a wild different a wild different a wild different different taste, right? But if your friend has have a but if your friends has a wild different taste, your list is not stable, making uh, making the event planning uh, quite hard to do. Okay. Hmm. But if your friends has a wild different taste, your list is not stable, making the event planning quite hard to follow up. Okay. So in other words, uh, exactly. In other words, uh, if things change a lot, exactly, if things change a lot without knowing it, uh, it is hard to do. It is hard to. Is that if, in other words, if things change a lot without knowing it, uh, it is hard to know. It is hard to know what changed. All right. Unless you keep you keep you keep track of them, right? Unless you keep track of them, or they come in an orderly fashion, one way after the another. So two things here. So, or you keep track of them, or you receive them in order. Okay. Or you keep track of them, or you receive them in order. Okay, makes a ton of sense. Okay, all right. Okay, good, 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 good. Okay. Oh, powerful, powerful. Absolutely, absolutely. So that'll be all for this video. Yeah, I do think. Let me double check here. Yep. That'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye bye.